Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're looking into the latest PortalFuse Weekly Security Update Report for Patch Tuesday, February 2025.
Patch Tuesday. Always a busy day for us, huh?
Yeah, we always get a bunch of CVEs, but this week's report is, well, it's a doozy.
It is, yeah.
Over 30 unique vulnerabilities across various Windows components.
Lots to cover.
Let's jump right in, maybe start with some of the critical vulnerabilities.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. This report highlights, I think, one of the biggest things, the constant need to stay on top of updates.
For sure.
Particularly for system administrators and security professionals, it's a centralized source of patching information that they rely on.
Definitely.
So very important.
Let's start with the critical vulnerabilities then.
Okay.
Because those always demand immediate attention.
They do, yeah.
One that jumps out at me is CVE 2025-21379.
Yeah.
A remote code execution vulnerability in the DHCP client service.
Right. This one affects both Windows Server 2025 and Windows 11. The attack complexity is thankfully high.
Oh, good. It requires the attacker to be on the same network segment.
Okay.
And needs user interaction as well. So while this does make it less likely to be exploited in the wild, it's still a serious concern for organizations.
It makes you wonder how an attacker would even get on the same network segment in the first place.
Right, yeah. Social engineering, maybe some other vulnerability they could leverage to get on that network segment.
Yeah, that's probably a discussion for another time, though.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. We've got CVE 2025-21376, another critical RCE.
Yep.
This time targeting the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, LDAP.
Right. LDAP vulnerabilities are always concerning because it's such a core component in many enterprise environments.
Yeah.
Particularly those that are heavily reliant on Active Directory.
Right.
This vulnerability allows for unauthenticated remote code execution on vulnerable LDAP servers.
Yeah.
Which is a significant threat.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Exploiting that one could potentially give an attacker complete control over the entire domain.
Right.
Yeah. If they can gain control over the domain controller through that vulnerability.
Yeah, so not good.
No, that's very bad. Definitely want to patch immediately.
Okay. Shifting gears to CVE 2025-21367, this one affects the Win32 kernel subsystem.
Okay.
And it's another privilege escalation vulnerability.
Yeah, so this one allows attackers to elevate privileges from low-level access to system-level access locally.
Locally.
Yes. So that means even if an attacker gains access to a low-privilege account, they can leverage this to gain complete control over the affected machine.
Oh, wow.
What's even more concerning is that it doesn't require any user interaction.
That's scary stuff. It's like a ticking time bomb.
It is, yeah.
The last of the critical vulnerabilities, at least for now, is CVE 2025-2120. This one is another elevation of privilege vulnerability, but this time it's targeting WinSock.
Okay.
Specifically, the ancillary function driver. Right.
So this vulnerability is caused by a heap-based buffer overflow. It allows for local privilege escalation to system. It's like the last one?
Similar to the previous one, yes. And unfortunately, this one also doesn't require user interaction.
Okay.
And has a low attack complexity, making it relatively easy to exploit. Heap-based overflows, just a reminder, they occur when a program attempts to write data beyond the allocated memory space in the heap, potentially overwriting adjacent memory and leading to code execution or other unexpected behaviors.
Right. So in essence, an attacker could craft a malicious input that triggers this overflow, leading to arbitrary code execution with system privileges.
Exactly.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is, yeah. And this is why these types of vulnerabilities are rated critical in the PortalFuse Weekly Security Update Report.
I can see why.
Because their combination of high impact and relatively low attack complexity makes them prime targets for attackers.
Let's move on to some of the other notable vulnerabilities in this report.
Even if they aren't marked as critical. One that caught my eye is CVE 2025-21377. What's interesting about this one is that it affects all supported versions of Windows.
Right. This is an NTLM hash disclosure vulnerability. Essentially, an attacker can potentially gain access to user NTLM-v2 hashes through a network-based attack with minimal user interaction.
Okay.
NTLM-v2 hashes, although considered more secure than their predecessors, can still be vulnerable to brute force attacks.
Right.
And other techniques used to uncover the original password.
So even with strong passwords, the potential for compromise is there. Patching is critical here, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Patching is always going to be your first line of defense with something like this.
Next up, we have CVE 21358, another EOP, but this time it's in Windows Core messaging.
Okay.
While it's not as impactful as a kernel-level exploit, it's still a concern.
It is.
What makes this one stand out? I mean, we've seen a few EOPs already.
So this one also has a low attack complexity and is exploited through an untrusted pointer dereference. Pointers, just as a quick reminder, they are variables that store memory addresses of other variables or data.
Right.
An untrusted pointer dereference occurs when a program accesses memory using a pointer that has not been properly validated,
Right.
potentially leading to crashes or arbitrary code execution. What's interesting here is that we've seen a trend in similar vulnerabilities being discovered in this component. It might indicate an underlying architectural weakness that Microsoft needs to address.
Something to keep an eye on.
For sure.
Let's talk about this cluster of CVEs. 2025, 21352, 21254, 2122216, and 21212.
Okay.
These seem to be related in some way.
They are. All four of these are denial of service, DOS vulnerabilities affecting internet connection sharing, ICS, across different Windows versions.
Across different versions?
Yes.
Wow.
This recurring trend of DOS vulnerabilities and ICS suggests a potential weakness in this component that could be targeted by attackers.
Yeah, DOS attacks might not be as glamorous as remote code execution, but they can still be incredibly disruptive.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Especially if they target critical systems or services.
Right. Think about, hospitals, power grids, financial institutions.
Right.
An attacker could exploit these vulnerabilities to disrupt network connectivity for users, potentially impacting business operations.
Well, sure.
Or even causing safety issues in certain environments.
All right, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more vulnerability we need to touch on. And it's not even in Windows itself.
Oh, okay.
This one affects Microsoft Edge, the Chromium-based version.
Right. CVE 2025-21408. This is a remote code execution vulnerability in Microsoft Edge, caused by a type confusion issue.
Okay.
Type confusion vulnerabilities occur when a program handles data of one type as if it were of a different type.
Right.
This can lead to memory corruption and potentially code execution if an attacker can manipulate the data in a way that triggers the type confusion.
So this one is potentially serious. How would an attacker actually exploit this vulnerability?
It requires user interaction, meaning a user would have to click on a malicious link.
Right.
Or open a specially crafted file. So while it's a serious vulnerability, it's not as easily exploitable as some of the others we've discussed.
That's good to hear. And I believe Microsoft has already released a fix for this one.
They have, yes.
In the latest version of Edge, correct?
Yes. Version 133.0.3065.51 addresses this vulnerability, so it's crucial for users to update their Edge browser as soon as possible.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into this week's PortalFuse Weekly Security Update Report. We've seen a range of vulnerabilities, from critical remote code execution and privilege escalation flaws to denial of service and information disclosure issues.
A lot to unpack.
It's a reminder that security is a multifaceted challenge.
It is.
And we need to be prepared to defend against attacks from all angles.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. So maybe we shift our focus now to some real-world attack scenarios.
Okay.
That could leverage these vulnerabilities. Maybe start with CVE 2025-21379, the DHCP client service RCE.
Okay.
Although an attacker would need to be on the same network segment to exploit this vulnerability, a determined attacker could potentially leverage other vulnerabilities or social engineering techniques to gain that initial access.
So even though it's not a simple exploit, it could still be part of a larger multi-stage attack.
Yeah, exactly. Once on the network segment, an attacker could exploit this vulnerability to gain remote code execution on machines running vulnerable DHCP clients, giving them a foothold to move laterally within the network.
That lateral movement is often the key to a successful attack, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
They gain a small foothold and then use that to expand their access until they reach their ultimate target.
Precisely, yeah. Now consider CVE 2025-21376, the LDAP RCE vulnerability. This one has the potential for serious damage, especially in an Active Directory environment.
Because LDAP is essentially the directory service for Active Directory, right?
That's right, yeah.
It's how all the users and computers are authenticated and authorized.
Exactly. If an attacker can exploit this vulnerability to gain control of a domain controller, they effectively control the keys to the kingdom.
Right.
They could create new user accounts with administrative privileges, manipulate existing accounts, and even disable security features,
Oh, wow.
allowing them to move freely within the network and exfiltrate sensitive data.
It's a stark reminder of just how crucial it is to keep domain controllers patched and protected. A single vulnerability can have far-reaching consequences.
It really can, yeah.
Okay. Let's move on to the privilege escalation vulnerabilities. We have CVE 2025-2136 affecting the Win32 kernel subsystem and CVE 2025-210.4 in WinSock. Both allow attackers to escalate privileges to system level. We've talked about the technical details, but let's paint a picture of how these vulnerabilities could be exploited in a real-world attack scenario.
Sure. So imagine an attacker successfully phishes a user with a malicious attachment or link,
Okay.
gaining access to their machine with limited privileges. This is a common starting point for many attacks.
Yeah.
With an EOP vulnerability like CVE 2025-21367 or CVE 2025-2014-18, the attacker can then escalate their privileges to system,
Right.
effectively taking complete control of that machine.
From there, they can do pretty much anything they want on that machine.
Well, they can, yes.
Install malware, access sensitive data, pivot to other systems on the network.
Yeah, exactly. And the lack of user interaction required for these particular exploits makes them even more dangerous.
Right.
The escalation happens silently in the background, often without any indication to the user.
It really highlights the importance of layered security.
It does.
Even if an attacker manages to gain initial access, we need to have measures in place to limit their ability to move laterally and escalate privileges.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So now, consider CVE 2025-21377, the NTLM hash disclosure vulnerability. Remember, this one affects all supported versions of Windows.
Yep.
It allows an attacker to potentially obtain user NTLMv2 hashes.
These hashes are what's used to authenticate users, even if they have strong passwords, right?
That's right. Although considered more secure than older NTLM versions, NTLMv2 hashes can still be susceptible to attacks. If an attacker obtains these hashes, they can potentially use them in pass-the-hash attacks
Okay.
to authenticate as those users on other systems without ever needing to know their actual password.
So even with strong password policies in place, there's still a risk if these hashes are compromised.
There is, yes. Exactly. This highlights the need to move away from legacy authentication protocols like NTLM
Okay.
and adopt more secure alternatives like Kerberos, which is less susceptible to these types of attacks.
Let's talk about the recurring vulnerabilities we're seeing in certain components. We have the Windows Core Messaging EOP, CVE 2025-21358, and the cluster of DOS vulnerabilities in ICS, CVE 2025-21352, 212.105, 212.2016, and 212.12.
Right. The repeated emergence of these vulnerabilities suggests potential architectural weaknesses that need to be addressed. Microsoft needs to investigate these components more thoroughly to determine if there are underlying design flaws that are contributing to these recurring issues.
It's almost like they're playing whack-a-mole,
Yeah.
fixing one vulnerability only to have another pop up in the same area.
Right, yeah. It's a valid concern. A more comprehensive approach is needed to harden these components
Okay.
and prevent similar vulnerabilities from appearing in the future.
Let's move on to the final vulnerability we touched on earlier.
Okay.
The remote code execution vulnerability in Microsoft Edge, CVE 2025-21428. While it does require user interaction, it's still a concern because attackers are constantly finding new ways to trick users into clicking malicious links or opening infected files.
Right. Social engineering remains a highly effective attack vector.
It does.
Phishing attacks, watering hole attacks, and other techniques are constantly evolving to bypass security measures and exploit human vulnerabilities.
So even with technical safeguards in place, user education and awareness are crucial for mitigating these types of threats.
They are, absolutely. Users need to be aware of the risks and know how to identify suspicious emails, websites, and attachments.
Right.
They should be wary of unsolicited links, verify the sender's address, and be cautious about opening files from untrusted sources.
It's a constant battle to stay ahead of the attackers.
It is.
But that's the nature of cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
We need to be vigilant, proactive, and constantly adapt our defenses to the evolving threat landscape.
Couldn't agree more. So that wraps up part 2 of our analysis of the PortalFuse Weekly Security Update Report.
Okay.
We've delved into some specific attack scenarios, highlighting the potential impact these vulnerabilities could have if exploited. In part 3, we'll conclude by looking at some broader takeaways and recommendations.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our analysis of this week's PortalFuse Weekly Security Update Report. It's clear that the threat landscape is constantly evolving,
It is.
and attackers are becoming more sophisticated in their techniques.
Absolutely. This report serves as a stark reminder that security is not a one-time fix,
Right.
but an ongoing process. We need to be constantly vigilant, proactive, and adaptable in our approach to defending against these threats.
What are some key takeaways from this report that our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, the first and most obvious takeaway is the critical importance of patching.
Yeah.
We've seen multiple critical vulnerabilities this month,
Uh-huh.
and patching is the most effective way to mitigate these risks. Organizations need to prioritize patching
For sure.
and establish efficient processes to ensure that systems are updated promptly, especially those affecting critical systems and infrastructure.
We always say that, but it's worth repeating.
It is.
Patching is the foundation of a strong security posture.
It really is. Beyond patching, we need to emphasize the importance of defense in depth.
Right.
This means having multiple layers of security in place to protect against a wide range of threats. This includes things like strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, intrusion detection systems, and endpoint protection.
It's about making it as difficult as possible for attackers to succeed, even if they manage to bypass one layer of security.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the human element. Security awareness training for all users is absolutely crucial.
Oh, for sure.
Users need to be educated about the risks
Uh-huh.
and empowered to identify and report suspicious activity.
They're often the first line of defense, so it's essential to equip them with the knowledge and tools to recognize and avoid threats.
Exactly. Another important takeaway is the need to stay informed about emerging threats and vulnerabilities.
Okay.
Reports like the one from PortalFuse are invaluable resources for staying up to date on the latest threats and vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
They provide the insights and information we need to prioritize our security efforts
Right.
and focus on the most critical areas. Looking ahead, I think we'll continue to see attackers focusing on exploiting vulnerabilities in commonly used software and services. They're always looking for the path of least resistance,
Yeah.
and that often means targeting software with a large install base.
Right. So it's more important than ever to have robust vulnerability management processes in place to identify and remediate vulnerabilities quickly.
Absolutely. And as we've seen with some of the vulnerabilities in this report, we need to be prepared for attacks that chain together multiple vulnerabilities or leverage social engineering techniques to bypass traditional security measures.
It's a reminder that attackers are constantly evolving their tactics,
Right.
and we need to be equally adaptable in our defenses.
Couldn't agree more. This week's PortalFuse Weekly Security Update Report has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
But more importantly, it provides us with actionable insights to improve our security posture and protect our systems and data. By staying vigilant, proactive, and informed, we can stay ahead of the curve and mitigate the risks posed by these evolving threats.
Great insights. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive into the report. I think our listeners will find this information invaluable as they navigate the complex world of cybersecurity.
They should, yeah.
Until next time, stay safe out there.